Well, I tried to force myself to focus today, but I got sidetracked on this, and I'll be honest, it's much more interesting than trying to write annual reports about stuff. Like, my committee did things. Why do you need to know what all we did? We did good stuff. I hate writing it up. Anyway, one of the fun things I get to do that I like doing because it's kind of mindless is link checking. And today in Hein Online's Legal Classics, I bumped into the Hindu Law of Adoption from 1891. There's another edition, I think, from 20 years earlier. And unfortunately, with the way Hein Online is, I can't download the whole book unless I do it section by section. But I found it interesting enough that I wanted to share the table of contents with you guys. Now, I'm going to preface this. I am a northern United States white person, and I am going to mispronounce names, and I have very, 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 very little understanding of how the caste system works, as well as a lot of other things about the Indian culture, Hindu or otherwise. So, hopefully not going to offend anyone covering some of this. Going to be respectful, and it is over 100 years old. But like I said, there's a lot of things that I wouldn't have thought of, and if you know anything, even a smidgen that I know of about Indian society, you'll kind of find these considerations kind of interesting. I don't know. I did. Your mileage may vary. But without further ado, scroll past that. So we open with the origin of adoption and status of sons and wives in ancient law. And those of us who are anti-adoption are probably not surprised that adoption is directly related to slavery. No real shocker there. And then we have invalid adoption and slavery, and then what happened to adoption after slavery was abolished in India. And then we get into these really interesting 17 descriptions of sons. So we have the Orasa, or the legitimate son, the Kastraja, and again, I told you I was going to murder these names, or appointed wife's son. And then we have, and also it's kind of boring in my slight defense, Paun Arabhava, or son of a twice married woman, Gudhaja, or secretly born son of an adulterous wife, Sahadhaja, or son of the pregnant bride, which sounds like someone who got knocked up beforehand, and then Kanina, or an unmarried damsel's son. And then you have, again, unmarried damsel's son, someone got in trouble. Putrika Putra, son of an appointed daughter. Now, those are the sons in operation by law. And then the next five are the adopted sons. So we have the Krita, or purchased son, the Daitaka, or given son, the Savyandata, or self-given son, the Kritrima, or the son made, the Apabidha, or deserted son, and then we have the other last descriptions of sons, which are another four. So we have Putrika, or appointed daughter, excuse me, not a son, although it says descriptions of sons, Vijaja, or natural son, Yatra Kavashatpadita, or son begotten on any woman, and Divya Mushnyanyanya, or son of two fathers. I don't know if that's because someone slept around. Yeah, it's a little confusing. I don't know. Again, I'm sorry, I'm not trying to be racist, I'm just very confused. Sudra, or son of a twice born by a Sudra wife. And again, you'll see twice born. I'm not quite sure what they mean by that. Again, very ignorant of Indian culture. But as someone who studies adoption, I did find this an interesting book and probably would have read it if I had a physical copy. Heck, I'd probably read it online, but I don't want to download each chapter individually. So the second is Doctrine of Spiritual Benefit and 12 Kinds of Sons. So we talk about the derivation of the word putra, so the doctrine of the spiritual benefit conferred by sons and how it was introduced for their benefit. The real legitimate son alone is competent to confer this particular spiritual benefit, not the subsidiary sons. And then it also goes into like divisions of wives, into patnis and non-patnis, the caste, the form of the marriage, virginity at the time of the marriage, non-marriage with another man, our conditions of patna, and so it basically goes into like how exactly you figure out the inheritance and keep going down on this. Whoa, sorry, scored a little too fast there. So yeah, it talks about like divisions of sons into real or primary and substitutionary. And then it also, goes into how that changed over time. The third section on sources of law, commentaries, and the 12 kinds of sons. There's a lot of commentary, which is the interesting part that I unfortunately can't read easily. So we have like commingling of religious and legal rules, and then this doubtful whether all rules are enforced. That was the other bit I was going to say. This is probably, I'm guessing, written by British settlers. So there is definitely some cultural racial bias happening here. But yeah, because for example, you'll see they contrast a lot of things with Roman law, but they also talk about effect of Muhammad's conquest on Brahmanical mind, its religious turn. Yeah, a lot of interesting people's theories on that, and I'm not sure if that's from an Indian perspective or from a white perspective. But obviously, the majority of this book is probably written for British people. Commentaries and sonship, so it talks about like prohibitions for the cow age, the age of destruction, I would assume, just knowing who Kelly is. And then we get into, the British period, the law of adoption, factum valet, which I should look up but didn't, and caste rules. So it talks about, the falling off of the practice adoption, and then for a while it was only Dataka and Kachima recognized, and then it talks about, like, how legislature and things were worn down to recognize other people. So who does it apply? Does it apply to the Brahmins? Spiritual and temporal objects, adoption of daughters. There's all sorts of interesting little side jobs here. And then it talks about, Nadita Panditas, says the spiritually obligatory to adopt sometimes. So that's that factum valet. Excuse me, I shouldn't have you in there. And they talk about like the word karta yava and a rule indicates it's directly, statement in the precept, the reason indicates it to be so you should adopt or forced to adopt. And that gets in the section on privileges of twice-born tribes and disabilities of Sudras and Brahmanical pretensions represented by Kashastriya. So again, we get into this caste thing. I have no idea how exactly that works. Intermarriage, interadoptions between different tribes, and the same between subdivisions of the same tribe was prohibited to the twice-born, but permitted to Sudras. All sorts of nuance. Indian society, very complicated. So we talk about like the capacity of men to adopt. This is kind of interesting, especially that you have to have an assent of the existing son before you can adopt another one. Double pour adoption was not prohibited. There was a distinction between simultaneous and successive adoptions. So successive sounds like you can adopt after the death of the first son, or the subsequent death of the first does not validate the second. Is a second adoption like totally void because you can only adopt once, but not in other parts of this it says. And is it void if the adopter's wife is pregnant, because it's in embryo? But no, that's not a bar to adoption. And then they go into some other scenarios. So missing sons going into religious orders, a disqualified son, not quite sure what that's about. Sons renouncing Hinduism, brothers adopters, bachelors, widowers, adoption by Brahmin, by disqualified people, by outcasts, by idiots or lunatics, by a man in extremis, which sounds like a guy who's dying, by a leper, by a minor, during pollution, which I assume is like the waiting period between sex, just based on my knowledge of Jewish law. Effective agreement not to adopt, and then there's like this father's power to restrain the son's capacity, and it sounds like the wife has to assent, although I'm pretty sure that's an easy one to get done. So we talk about like women's capacity to adopt. So we have like adoption by unmarried women, adoption competent to married women and widows. Adoption without authority is peculiar only to Bombay and the Jains. Talks about conditional authority, restrictions imposed by the husband, power to be exercised with consent of others. So it talks about sort of this wifely relationship and the relationship of adoption to the larger Indian family. So yeah, power given when there are two or more wives. Widows are actually not bound to adopt. No limit of time for adoption, though, if you wanted to adopt by a widow. Remarrying the widow, adoption with a kinsman's consent, consent to members of your joint family whose consent when the husband is separated. Effect of husband's prohibition, express or implied. Competition between the mother-in-law and the daughter-in-law, although I'm kind of sitting here going that'll happen regardless of adoption. Then we have chapter 7, who may give and be given. So we have the father's power again and the mother's assent. Parents only have the powers to give, they cannot delegate, so they can't be like, when I die, your uncle will adopt you out somewhere. An adopted son cannot be given an adoption. And I actually really like that one, because that's, to me, that sounds like you can't regift them. Like in foster care, when people get returned all the time because they're difficult children. So yeah, if you take someone on, you cannot be giving them away again. I like that. So you have to have the assent of the son, your relatives, and you can't regift whoever's been given to you. So yeah. So is it the firstborn, the youngest, one, two, only sons? Case law and validity. Da, 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 da. Anyway, the adoption of an only son when coexisting with another son's natural or adopted son, and then like the adoption of one son by two or more people. Again, we have these joint families, which I have never heard of, but totally can be plausible. Restrictions relating to selection of boy to be adopted, the rules of selection founded upon the relationship. So a lot of this sounds like it's to prevent incest, so like capacity being begotten by the adopter himself, so you don't want to accidentally cause your family tree to stop forking. So yeah, we have like marriage theory, incongruous relationship relative to the adoptive mother. Yeah, case law regarding prohibited degrees for the twice born classes, and then we have like adoption of disqualified people, limitation from age and performance of initiatory rights. So, yeah, but there's even more. But wait, there's more. Formalities and ceremonies necessary for a valid adoption. So we have like this gift and acceptance are absolutely necessary, and they must be accompanied by the actual delivery. I like that. Again, it's like you can't just say you're going to give us 1,000 rupees for somebody and then not fork it over. Conditional acceptance by widow and fraud upon the power. So yeah, it talks about which tribes and who does exactly what ceremonies for what, which again know nothing about. Could be totally fascinating from an anthropological perspective. So then we have the effect of adoption on the status and inheritance of the adoptee. So there are prohibited degrees for an adopted son's marriage, the impurity on deaths and births, because you can't participate fully, I guess, in the spiritual part of the society. You can't inherit from your natural relations. You have vested rights before adoption, and then you may or may not lose them. You may have a guardian if you're an infant, all sorts of exciting stuff. Adopted son's rights is against the adopter and in the joint family. Anti or post-adoption arrangement curtailing someone's interest. Adoptions by widow and divesting, and yeah, all sorts of fun estate questions here. Divesting, estate inherited by adopting widow from her son, and then there's like a divesting of a co-widow's estate. Divesting the widow is a member of a joint family, adopts under the express authority of the husband. Relation back with adoption, alienation of a widow, rights to the adopted son of an again disqualified person. And then we have effects of invalid adoption and litigation relating to adoption. So yeah, deeds, wills, limitation for suits relating to invalid adoption, when adoption made by a widow, when adoption made by the father, starting point, as well as the presumption of adoption by a sonless person. And then we have Kritrima son, adoption by non-Hindus, and special forms of adoption. So this is our last little section here, and so we have like the capacity to adopt in Katrima form, capacity to give oneself in Katrima adoption, and then the ceremonies. There's no restrictions to the capacity of being adopted except your caste, and then they talk about adoption among the Jains, as well as the Mohammedans, which I assume are the Islamics, and the Sikhs, and I don't know what the Parsis is, maybe the Persians. Adoption of the son-in-law, adoption of daughters. I like that the last section of this is completely adoption of daughters amongst Nakins or dancing girls and prostitutes. Like, out of everybody to bring into the family, the last section is, if you're bringing in girls that may have loose reputations. So, anyway, that is the lovely, is it Hindu Art of Adoption? No, it's not Art of Adoption. I'm thinking my other one. The Hindu law of adoption, excuse me, because this wasn't legal classics. Well, I hope you enjoy those of you that like looking at adoption stuff.